things that fit together and work for a purpose, how would they have come together? Okay, why does the universe appear to be ordered and designed to function so well together? What about the laws of mathematics and physics? Where do they come into play? Were they also randomly produced and generated? That was hard for people to believe. Well, a little later on, Empedocles, in 450 BC, 100 years later, he appreciated this problem and he realized that the phenomenon of adaptive complexity required specific naturalistic explanation. You can't just say, well, things came about through sea slime. That's not satisfying. So he proposed, Empedocles proposed, that the fantastic shapes of organic and inorganic objects was a result of continual random flux of matter. How convenient to say that. Everything that exists was generated by the purely random chance interaction of all possible combination of events. This is really out there because I don't see things around me fluctuating today. Why did it happen at one point in time and then produce all the stuff we see and then stop? Why did it stop? So that's not, to me, a very satisfying answer. But again, these are statements by men who did not want to believe in a supreme creator. They want to explain things naturalistically, as Darwin did, hundreds, actually millennia later. So Aristotle himself promoted this theory, and it's sometimes referred to as the Aristotelian abiogenesis theory. So, spontaneous generation or abiogenesis. Here's sort of the idea. Decaying meat produces flies. Okay. Garbage produces rats. This was actually believed by scientists. Okay. Darwinian evolution is based on a spontaneous generation type of idea, but that's been disproved and it's never been observed. Abiogenesis or spontaneous generation has never been observed and it's actually been disproved. And here's how it's been disproved. Back in 1668, there's an Italian scientist, a biologist. His name was Francisco Redi, and he published in 1668 his experiments on the generation of insects. And what did he do? Well, it's regarded as a milestone in the history of modern science for its time. In one experiment, he put raw meat into 3 jars. One jar remained uncovered, and one was covered with gauze, and the third one was sealed with a cork. Well, he demonstrated that maggots, the larval stage of flies, did not appear in meat from which adult flies were excluded. He's on to something here. Okay. Maggots only appeared on surfaces accessible to flies, such as the open jar and the gauze on top of the jar. Also, when dead flies or dead maggots were put into sealed jars with dead animals or veal, no maggots appeared. But when the same thing was done with living flies, maggots did appear. Okay. So he continued his experiments by capturing the maggots, and then he observed them metamorphosizing into flies, demonstrating the complete life cycle of the maggot to the fly. Okay. So though these experiments were simplistic, especially by our standards today, they were very powerful in demonstrating that you don't get life from non-life. You don't get flies from decaying meat. The decaying meat produces flies because flies already exist. They lay their eggs there, so their eggs can eat the dead decaying meat, which is, by the way, kind of interesting, that maggots will only eat dead flesh. You may have read or heard about stories about guys out in the wilderness, or they get their cars crash and they get a bad wound, and it starts getting infected, and flies come and lay eggs into the wound, open wound. Maggots will only eat dead flesh. They will not eat live flesh, and they actually clean up the wound. Okay, so these experiments were simplistic, but they demonstrated that life begets life. Maggots form on dead meat because flies who are already alive lay their eggs on that meat. Okay, but even into the late 1700s, there were some scientists in their writings, they still believed that mice were generated in piles of rotting garbage. It's very hard to change the inertia of scientific, what the scientists believe. So perhaps it's more surprising that prominent scientists today think that life arose spontaneously from a primordial soup, okay, under the right conditions. I put that in the same category as thinking that dead meat produces flies and garbage produces rats or mice. But that's what they believe, because they really have rejected God. Okay, a little more on this. Spontaneous generation was largely abandoned in the mid-1800s. Improvement in microscopes, the scientific instruments used to investigate these types of things were improved. Other scientific instruments enabled scientists to see the eggs and sperm of higher animals, more complex animals, the ovules, the eggs, the pollen of plants, bacteria, and other microorganisms to begin to get a better picture of how life begets life. In the mid-1800s, another scientist besides Francisco Redi, Louis Pasteur, actually observed the reproduction and growth of microorganisms, and he also demonstrated biogenesis, okay, that life begets life, that microorganisms grow in sterilized broth only if the broth was first exposed to air that contained their spores, i.e. their reproductive cells. Those flasks that were completely covered, stoppered up, produced no such thing. Life begets life. So Pasteur's discoveries led to the development of cell theory, which is talked about in modern biology books even today, of the origin of living matter. The cell theory is based on the fact that all life originates from pre-existing living material, and that's known as the law of biogenesis. So the theory of Darwinism, the theory of evolution, violates the law of biogenesis. Life is always observed as coming from pre-existing life, and that's even true in cloning. People say, well, what about cloning? The Dolly the sheep, which, by the way, I think she recently died. That sheep recently died, I think of natural causes. But the point is that they take a living cell and they produce a living animal. They haven't taken something dead. Even in cloning, they take something that's already pre-existing, that's alive. Biogenesis is the rule. Okay? Life begets life. Darwinism would have us believe that no, some pond, ancient pond, perennial pond somewhere, life through some electrical sparks, through lightning or whatever, and the right molecules got together and produced the first amino acids and proteins and all that, and then the first cell, simple cell got formed. Life coming from non-life. That's what Darwinian evolution would have you believe, but the law of biogenesis has never been violated. Also, second bullet I can talk about, that chemical reactions are reversible in water. It works against spontaneous generation of life. You have to have direction to cells forming proteins, and they go in one direction. If these cells that you expect to be produced, and these proteins that you expect to be produced, are just random, and there's no other external processes keeping them limited, and what can harm the creation of the proteins away from the process, you're going to have those proteins destroyed. And that's what would happen, because in water, chemical reactions are reversible. They go either way. So why should life favor one direction when nature, natural things, don't favor a direction? And in water, these things are reversible. And the theory says, well, things began in this ancient primordial ocean when there was water. Spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis, has never been observed or successfully demonstrated under laboratory conditions. We're going to talk a little bit about the Urey-Miller experiment in that regard. Many scientists have tried to recreate life from inorganic compounds, non-living compounds, such as the Miller-Urey experiment, only to fail each time. And so, I don't have this cartoon, but here's a caption of the cartoon. There are two scientists talking in the lab, and one of them says to the other one, if I can create life in this test tube, then it will prove that no intelligence was necessary to create it. All right. So here's the Miller-Urey experiment. It occurred in 1953. The starting materials are completely hypothetical. It's what the Darwinist, the evolutionist believes must have been the primordial environment, the primordial atmosphere, the primordial water that was there. There was no oxygen that was allowed. You couldn't have oxygen, right? So it was like ammonias and things of that sort. Why? Why no oxygen? Because oxygen is an oxidizing agent. It basically burns up things. And these things would get burned up. Yeah. Rust is an example of that. Rust is actually burning iron, you will. So no oxygen was allowed. So this is all speculative. It's all hypothetical of what they think had to have happened to have abiogenesis occur. Large amounts of ammonia and methane were introduced. They had a trap to condense out harmful gases. I don't know where this was supposed to have an analogy in real life when this was occurring, but they had to have a trap to condense out harmful gases to this process. By the way, this whole aspect of no oxygen allowed, the oldest rocks, the basement rocks, the granites, they're full of oxides. There was oxygen in the atmosphere. So, anyway, there was a spark mechanism that had to provide some energy, and they get asked, well, where did you get the electricity in nature? Well, that was a lightning strike or something. Well, usually a lightning strike is pretty destructive, not helpful. But they had a little spark mechanism in their flask. But the spark mechanism destroyed some products, so they had to move around their apparatus. They had to change the configuration of their glass apparatus and where traps were and where the spark was. So anyway, here's kind of a little cartoon of what they had. They had this apparatus with this big round flask. There were gases, ammonia, methane, water, hydrogen in there. There was a little spark discharge. There was a condenser to condense out those harmful gases. Then there was a trap down there. Then there was boiling water to provide some steam in there. And this was evacuated. And then they sparked this stuff, and then they collected what the sparks produced, the gases produced by the sparking mechanism, and all this stuff came out, okay? So, here's what happened. Here's the experimental results. The major product was organic sludge, tar. 85% of what was produced was tar. They produced tar, organic sludge. Carboxylic acids, which are not important to life at all, 13%. So now you're up to 98% of non-important stuff to the formation of life. 98% of the stuff that was created was totally inconsequential to proving spontaneous generation. There was only 2 amino acids that were formed. They were the simplest ones, glycine and alanine, in those percentages. A little over 1% and a little less than 1% for the other one. The other amino acids, 1/10%. And I'm not going to mention them all, but there they are. So only a total of 9 out of the 20 amino acids necessary for life, the building blocks of life, were formed, and they were only formed in very, very small quantities. So here's a summary. There were equal mixtures of what's called left and right-handed amino acids that were formed. In nature, in our bodies, amino acids only occur in the left-handed form. If they're in the right-handed form, it's usually a poison. That's what kills us. The right-handed amino acids mimic what the left-handed amino acids do to form proteins that are beneficial to life. They suck up the energy, basically, for what's the process that's supposed to have us allow that cell to live. It's like a key that goes into a lock, and that poison locks it up as a right-handed amino acid. So in this, in this experiment, 50-50. 50% were left-handed, 50% were right-handed. It's like tossing a coin. That couldn't have happened in real life. Real life, this experiment that was trying to show would have had to produce all left-handed amino acids for it to have any credibility in saying, hey, we were able to form, the building blocks of life artificially, synthetically. So it nullifies this.